everybody, I'm Pastor A.J. Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 28. Our guest today is Pastor Emily Tveite, who is the correct thing is the ELCA program director for campus ministries.
Perfect.
Got it. Okay. I was like, after I started talking, I was like, oh man, I'm gonna maybe botch her title. It's fine. So
right.
Emily has this really cool job. So she works for the ELCA and she works with all the campus ministry sites across the country, which is there's a distinction and people don't necessarily know this. So there's ELCA colleges. And then there's campus ministries, which are other public and private institutions that have a Lutheran campus ministry presence there. And so we, fall under that umbrella. So thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we are veering from the lectionary this week because there's nothing really uncomfortable about the lectionary. I hope you have a great Sunday at church and stay awake during your sermons. It'll be fine. Everything's going to be great. But that being said, we're going to veer away. And I know I said that we have sort of completed our Pride Month talks with Pastor Kelsey sharing her story, but we're going to do just one more because I think it's a good story to talk about. So, Pastor Emily and I are going to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, right? The fun stories and the fall of Sodom, which I won't read because it's actually quite long. So it's Genesis 19, like the whole chapter. It starts a little bit in 18, and it starts with like God's going to send Abraham, like, I'm going to destroy these places. And my favorite biblical narrative is this negotiating with God that Abraham does of, but what if there's like 25 righteous people? Okay, if there's 25, I won't destroy it. But what if there's only 20? And God's like, okay, well, I guess if there's 20, I won't destroy it. Well, what if there's only 10? Okay, fine. If there's only 10, I won't destroy it. And like, I love this idea that like Abraham negotiates God down. Like it is just my absolute favorite story. Because of that. And as we know, God did indeed choose to destroy these cities because they didn't find that many people, which is like really sad to say that, right? So the story kind of goes like this. I'll just paraphrase. So two messengers of the Lord go and they're going to the city to give this announcement. And Lot, who is Abraham's nephew, like knows that they're coming. He happens to live there. A thing to note about Lot, he is also a foreigner in this city, right? And so they go, Lot meets him at the city gates and takes him to his house and is like, I'm going to keep you here and protect you. And it says, all of the men of the city come and like beat on Lot's door and is like, send out your 2 guests so that we may rape them. And Lot's like, no, that's not a thing that we do here. They're like, yeah, we're gonna do all these horrible things to them. And Lot gives an answer that I don't necessarily like. But he was like, no, how about I send my daughters out? They're virgins. You could do whatever you want with them. And they're like, no, we want those 2 guys. And so the way that this has been traditionally used in the past, is this gets used as one of the clobber passages against the LGBT community. That's clearly why God destroyed these cities, was because all of these men were trying to have sex with other men. Right? And that's what we hear. And that's what gets, that's why you get this idea like sodomy laws is literally what they're called throughout our country in many of the ways. And for the record, most of those have, been ruled unconstitutional, but for the longest time, we tried to police people's sex lives using the justification of this story.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, though, is like, that's not actually what the issue was, right? It's like a couple of things. Like, one, super icky that Lot's like, hey, here are my daughters. Feel free to rape them as much as you like. That doesn't feel super great as a woman. And I try to continue to remind myself that in their particular culture and place and time, right, like women were mere property.
Right.
So it was less of an offense to rape these women than it would have been to rape these two men. Like the idea was that it would have brought shame upon them.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's sort of like Lot, I mean, absolutely disagree with this worldview, but it's sort of like Lot is offering something that he has the capacity, like he owns his daughters, right? So
Yeah,
he has the
correct. Yeah.
capacity to offer them as a gift to
He's trying to
like the
appease a
men who are
mob.
coming to him. He's trying to appease the mob.
Yeah.
And I think that really cuts into this whole idea of that he's actually preferencing these outsiders who've like come to visit him
Yeah.
over his own children in
Yeah.
terms of like turning them over to this like violent,
Mob.
angry mob, which is
Yeah.
again like super disturbing, but very counter to the way that the story has sort of been passed down from
Exactly.
like generation to generation.
Yeah. And so the thing that I'd really like to talk about is like what the actual sin of Sodom is. And so we actually get I gave this as a question. So when I do my sort of plug at the Delaware Maryland Synod Assembly to come to our live podcast recording, I always like to like ask questions about these like super uncomfortable parts of the Bible. And then the people who shout out the answers, they get a free t-shirt. And so I asked this, right? And so, what's the actual sin of Sodom? Someone shouted out right away. Great, free t-shirt. And I said, where in the Bible is that listed?
Mm-hmm.
Silence. And then finally, one person in the far corner actually got this. So, the sin of Sodom is laid out in the book Ezekiel.
Mm-hmm.
Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49, when like they're going on about a whole host of things that they're doing wrong, and they're using this as an example. This is what the guilt of this place was, right? And you don't want to be like them because this is where they got destroyed because of it. And so Ezekiel 16:49 says, "This is what the guilt of your this was the guilt of your sister Sodom, that she and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy."
Mm-hmm.
The sin was being inhospitable, right?
Yeah.
Which is just like a totally different way to read that story. Because the whole thing is it's not about the fact that men were trying to rape other men, like even they're trying to rape the women, right? The idea is that like that's not how you treat guests.
Mm-hmm.
You don't send them
That's
out
not
into
how
the
you treat,
island.
yeah. That's
Yeah, yeah.
not how
If
you treat
someone comes to your
outsiders.
city, please,
Yeah.
exactly. And so that's sort of like what Lot is sort of known for, like this idea of like he in that story, right? Like he meets them at the gate. That's what you do to be hospitable to outsiders, and you bring them into your home. That's what you do to hospitable
Yeah.
to outsiders. You keep them from being raped by an angry mob. That's totally what you should do if someone is taking refuge
Mm-hmm.
in your house, right? Like
Yeah.
that idea. And so when it's laid out like that, like it very much changes the story about what does God want for us
Yeah.
as God's children.
Yeah. And you said that you love the end of Genesis 18. And I think that if you back up even a little further in Genesis 18, I love the story that comes right before where Abraham argues with God. And it's the one where Abraham is out under the oaks of Mamre, and he
Mm-hmm.
has these visitors that come to him. And then he, of course, tells them to sit down and make themselves comfortable. And
Yeah,
then he goes off to Sarah, his wife, who does all the work in the story, and she
sure.
like makes them some food and brings them out. But the whole idea is that that in Genesis 18 that Abraham is entertaining angels, like messengers from God, and doesn't know that they're angels. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
there's this other element of the story that um not just that like we not just that we welcome outsiders or strangers because that's the right thing to do, or even because they're maybe less privileged than we are, but also because like we see God in everybody, people who are different from us, and
Yeah.
we try to honor that which is um reflected of God in them, and I think that that's such a, I don't know. And
Well,
I don't know if
that
it's the
even
same.
brings up,
Yeah.
like one of
Yeah.
the most famous verses in the New Testament, right? Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing
Hmm.
so, some have entertained angels without knowing it.
Yep.
We like to throw
Yeah.
that around too, right? Okay, so what does that mean, right? Like when we're talking about
Hmm.
this, what is God calling us to do in these situations? To love and to serve and to host others, not knowing who they are or what they're
Right.
doing or like even what kind of people that they are. Like that's not our
Yep.
job to cast judgment on that. Our job
Right.
is to love them and care for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even in people who we disagree with or who we don't like, I mean, I think that we still are called to look for that part of them which reflects God and which we can honor, that we can honor
Mhm.
God through honoring somebody else, even if we don't like them or want to offer them hospitality or be
Yeah.
kind to them.
I shared this with Pastor Emily before we started recording. So in my current life where I'm sitting, just came back from a freshman orientation fair for the College of Charleston. So we go and we set up a nice little booth and talk about Lutheran campus ministries and, talk to people about like what we do and why we would love to welcome and host you. And there's this one student that like came up and he was like, and I was, gave my little spiel and he's like, yeah, that sounds really great. But like, what are like the policies, the rules? I was like, I didn't understand his question. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And he was like, well, like, like the Catholics, like you have to be Catholic. And I was like, oh yeah, you don't have to be Lutheran. We don't really care about that. And he was like, no, 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 no. Like do you have to be Christian or whatever too? And I was like, no, you're good. We don't, no one's, it's going to be fine. And he was like, no, 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 no. But like, do you have to say the certain words, right? Of like accepting Jesus or something to whatever. And I was like, no, for the
no.
last
Yeah.
time. Yeah. You're going to come. We're going to share food with you. We're going to love you, give you hugs. And zero people are
Hmm.
ever going to ask if you're a Christian or if you're Lutheran or if you
Right.
accept the Lord Jesus into your heart. Like, no one's going to ask you any of those things. Like, when we say that, come as you are, like, that's genuinely what we mean.
What we
Right. And
mean.
like,
Yeah.
um, and so you'll find folks that'll be like, but that's like, our job is to like spread the good news of the gospel and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, yeah, but like, that's what I am doing by like feeding people and welcoming
Right.
them and giving them a safe space to exist, right? Like that's
Yeah.
college is tough, right? Like
Yep.
if I don't care if you're Lutheran or Christian, but if you find affinity that these people give you life and support you and that you feel safe here, that you can come
Hmm.
and study and eat dinner and just be you, that is me
Yeah.
sharing the
That's the
good news.
purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
And
and
so
I think it like so many students when they go to campus and they look for a campus ministry, what they find is that they find a space that they think is what you're talking about, AJ. Like they find a space that they think is welcoming and is accepting of who they are and is life-giving. And then, um, sometimes after a semester or a year or just a couple months, they realize that
the
that
bait and
space,
switch.
yeah, the bait and switch. Like, I mean, I don't know, this, you've been in campus ministry a while, and I was in campus ministry at a college too, and you see the students who they thought that they found their tribe, they thought they
Yeah.
found their people, and then it hurts a lot more when you're welcomed and you're loved up to a point, and then you're sort of
Yeah.
you get the flip, yeah, and then suddenly you're not okay, and
Yeah. Now you need to
yeah,
do all these things.
you're sort of thrown to the wolves, or
Yeah.
or maybe the angry mob, right?
We had a student, like a few students that like didn't like grow up Christian and stuff like that. And I was like, well, like if you want to do the thing and like, learn more about it or like do a confirmation or something, like we're here for you. Like if you want to get baptized, I would love to do that
Hmm.
for you. But I want to be clear, that is not a requirement
Right.
for you to share in this work with us, to share in this
Yeah.
life, to be a part of this community.
Hmm. And it's almost like, I don't know about you, but like I've sometimes felt like a sense of like hesitancy because I want so much for students to feel loved and cared for just as they are, that I almost like don't want to even push
Yeah.
that that's something that I would want for them. Of course, like as followers of Christ, like we want people to know that that love comes from that space, right?
Yeah.
And experience that for themselves too. But like we don't want it to ever we don't want anybody to ever think, well, you've been here for 3 months now, so it's time for me to tell you that you need to
Yeah.
change yourself in some
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, that's not a thing that we do. Um, so one of these other students, so a student we had last year, literally like came to campus and had joined a different campus ministry at first and spent a whole year part of this campus ministry. And then kind of felt that like vibe of like there's some things that aren't meshing with like how
Mm-hmm.
I understand the world and the universe and what they're saying to me. And decided, just walked right into the Lutheran Campus Ministries last year and was like, just kind of feeling us out, giving it a checkout, giving it a thing, um, and just never left, right? And
Yeah.
so she came back like it was one of our first like meals of the semester, and she brought like 3 or 4 friends to come to like our Wednesday night dinner and hang out and stuff. And I found out later that it was like kind of a test. Like none of these people
Mm,
identified as Christian and had been very unwelcoming in other spaces. And she was like, I knew that it would be safe to bring them here. I would have never,
mm-hmm.
I could have never brought them to my other campus
Yeah.
ministry. And that was a thing that mattered to me so deeply is knowing that like that they were like genuinely just like welcome to come and eat and hang out and listen and learn
Mm-hmm.
and talk and laugh with everyone else. Right. Like,
Yeah.
um, it's just like, you
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? Like, it's just one of those things of sort of, oh, okay, I understand where you're coming from now. Right. Like
Right.
when we say
Yeah.
like, like we just like mean it.
Yeah. And like, I think that it's so important because sometimes I think uh, there are people like in the ELCA who criticize, maybe criticize is too strong, but who really note that like maybe campus ministry, like we've really gone all in on like reaching out to people who are queer or like being
We
like
are too
really
radically welcome
we're
for the
too
body of
radically
Christ.
welcoming. Right, exactly. But I think it's so important because I think in a lot of parts of our society, it's hard for people to understand that sort of I feel like we have to go that far to be radically welcoming in
Mhm.
order for people to know that they really are welcome. And part of that is that it's in campus ministry, these like experiences of like sort of this like contingent, soft, conditional welcome is still like so common. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Also, so campus ministry is so when we meet people in campus ministry, right? Like we're meeting them at a very vulnerable time of their life, right? Like they're
Mm-hmm.
on their own for the first time. They're actually making their own decisions. Like, say they did grow up in a Lutheran church and they come and like they either don't want to be involved, like they want to take a break from church or like are feeling something else, right? And so like it's how do we make space for them to ask questions and to grow and in
Mm-hmm.
whatever that looks like. And I think for me like that's one of the most beautiful part of doing campus ministry is being able to walk with students towards this like becoming an independent adult, right? That like now
Right.
you're doing things because you want to do them or like
Mm-hmm.
now you're actually starting to question things that like maybe your parents said that you're like, I don't know if I like agree with
Agree
this
with
or like
that.
maybe you do or like, but actually like doing that exploration of deciding, I come down on this side of things or that like I think that even just creating that space to like ask those questions is a space that like a lot of students don't necessarily feel comfortable in.
Right. Yeah. And I think, yeah, I don't think that the space of sort of, yeah, asking questions or admitting lack of certainty, that's not something we model well in our congregations.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of students come to us with a really firm idea of what it means to be a person of faith, and that involves a lot of certainty and like a lot of um I'm like not necessarily pride, but like a sense of like sureness in one's own position that um I mean, most young adults don't feel about their faith. And honestly, like most of us who've thought about our faith at all don't really feel about our faith
Yeah.
either.
Well, that's one of the
Um,
beautiful things that I like to do. Like, if you've listened to one of my sermons, I have no problem saying, like, what's the answer? I don't know.
I don't know.
And that's
Yeah.
okay. Right? Like,
Yeah.
we don't, I mean, that's the beauty of the mystery of our faith. Like, we don't get to know everything. Our
Right.
faith is
Right.
not built on facts. If it were, the whole
Right.
thing falls apart. Right? Like,
Yeah.
it's sort of like you have faith in the gifts and the promise, and then everything else falls into place after that.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's a
Mm-hmm.
Lutheran approach to, what we
Yeah. And the whole idea, I think it's a really Lutheran idea that like we take the parts of scripture and the parts of our faith tradition that are speak to us like most clearly and that we feel are most certain, and we center those, and then there's a lot of stuff on the edges that um maybe we don't fully understand, like what the Bible has to say about that, or the really complicated history that our like church tradition brings to that. But like that's sort of on the periphery, and we can still hold really closely to the middle, right? Which is
Yeah.
this experience of um
Well, and to hold
sort of
space that like
self-sacrificial love, right?
and to
That
hold space
Jesus,
that like we don't necessarily know, right? And there are these things that we got to wrestle with. And I don't know about you, but I decided let's have a podcast about that so that people can know it's okay to wrestle with these things
right?
and talk about
Yeah.
them. And like,
Yep.
yeah, there are a lot of really uncomfortable parts,
Mm-hmm.
and no, there's not always a good answer. And that
Right.
we're not going to justify it away, right? It just is.
Yeah. And sometimes I
And
think
how do
it's
we find faith in it, despite of some of those things?
right. And sometimes I think it's more helpful for people to like see and hear like the questions and the like sort of iterations of like ideas that like get us to the sermon than like the actual sermon at the end. Like when you get up there on Sunday morning, usually I mean, hopefully like you've come to something that feels polished and like it feels clear. But
Yeah, I usually just say a lot of my thoughts out
yeah.
loud.
But I mean, right, in most, at least I think all preachers, the I don't know, the process to get there is usually messy and full of doubt and full of
Mhm.
I don't know, sometimes I think anger like at the text too. You're like, I don't want to, this isn't actually what I want to talk about.
At all.
Why did you
Yep.
give me this one?
I um I um I actually don't have a problem saying a lot of things in the pulpit, which is, met with whatever. And sometimes it's really good because there's sometimes I get a lot of feedback is sort of like I've been waiting. I literally had one person, this is at my previous congregation in Iowa, literally said, I've been a member of this church for 30 years and I have been
Yeah.
waiting for someone to actually say that.
Yeah.
So you have a
Yeah.
lot of that. And like you also have like I've had conversations where they're like that rubbed me the wrong way. And I was like, great, let's talk about it. Like to me, that's
Yeah.
a good thing. Like if there's something I said
If
that
it
like
brings something
forced
up
you
in
to
you.
think
Yeah.
about more and to discern and whatever, great.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for too.
Yeah.
I could tell you cute little stories, but I don't know if that's helpful for
Right.
anyone, right? Like
Yeah.
I
No,
want you to critically think, right? And
yeah,
again,
that's
if you come down on the side of like I don't have an answer or I disagree with you, great, but you thought about
great. Yeah, that's the purpose. Yeah, and it's hard, right? I mean, I think and it's beautiful. I remember when I was uh serving at Wisconsin, I had a student come to me one day and she came into my office and sat down and she was like, I have some questions about things. And we had a lot of students who had grown up in more conservative versions of Lutheranism, and she was one of those students. And she came to me and she was like, well, I was always taught that like women can't be pastors and that like that's in the Bible. And I was like, okay, well, that's not our tradition. And she was like, but like, how do you make sense of that with the Bible? And I'm like, well, the Bible was like written in a different time and a different place. And
What also
some of
doesn't
the like
even say that. There's like literally
doesn't
one
say that.
verse.
No,
Like,
it doesn't say that, right? But
let's
then I
talk about the
remember
first
saying,
messengers of the gospel. Let's talk about the lady elect and her children.
right,
Let's talk
right,
about Lydia. Let's talk about all of these
all
people
the women,
that
right,
were
for
doing
sure.
all of this work, right? Like,
But then AJ, I said something that later I was like, I shouldn't have said it quite the way I did, but I did. And I was like, well, the Bible's just wrong about some things.
oh,
And she was like, oh, like,
oh,
she was like, that's freaking me out a little bit. Like, that's what she
mm,
said. She's like, this is scary to me. And I think it is scary, right? To think like that the Bible could be wrong about things. But I think in order to be to take the Bible like seriously, you have to be willing
yeah.
to wade into it and realize that I don't know that you have to be willing to wrestle, right?
We have these like we talk about this actually a lot on the podcast of understanding the difference between taking the Bible literally versus taking the Bible seriously. And
Seriously.
also
Yeah.
that when we enter into a text, right, which is part of what we do is as part of this podcast, right, is we enter into what's happening at the time and place. Why are these people
Hmm.
saying it, whatever? And always, every single time we enter an epistle, I remind people we are reading someone else's mail.
Yeah,
This
absolutely.
this was not for you.
Yeah.
This was very specifically written to a specific people in a specific place in a
Right.
specific time. And
Right. And
so
so
when
like
we lift things out of that and decide, well, God said this. Well, God didn't actually say that.
right. And that's why it's okay to be like, well, we don't love that like, lots like please take my daughters instead of these guests. But I mean,
Yep, don't love that.
no, that's terrible. And we can totally disagree with that as a practice. But I mean, the sort of the function of daughters in biblical times is totally different, right?
But
Than
also
in
to
our time.
understand the difference of what it says here. It does not say God told Lot to do this. God did not
No,
say send your daughters out there to be
true,
raped.
true.
Like
Yeah,
that's, you know what I'm saying?
that's
Like
not true.
that's
Yeah,
right.
yes,
So like it is not okay for any of those people to be in those positions, right? Like this was a
right,
decision that Lot was making, trying to in some way like appease a mob in order that they don't storm his house and burn everything down and like
right.
hurt these people, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and also you do have to take into consideration, right? Like those men's lives were highly much more valuable than the women.
Than daughters. Yes, absolutely. Well, and like, and just the reality too that I mean, the Bible is full of this, and real life is full of this. There are a lot of people who make really they don't make the right choice, but they try to make it for the right reason, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think Lot's just trying to like, I don't know, do the best he can in
Yeah.
that
Well, it's
moment
that.
too.
So, I think I've said this before on the podcast, but our senior pastor here at St. Matthew's says he was interviewed for something, and he said his favorite thing about being Lutheran is the gray area. That like we don't
Mm-hmm.
have the black and white, the whatever. Like I don't necessarily agree with Lot's decision, but he's put between a rock and a hard place, and he has to make a decision. And like, is there grace for the gray area that like we're trying to do the right thing,
Yeah.
regardless of what the black and white answers are? That like we are all put in specific
Mm-hmm.
places, and like you can't always let life's not that like life is not that cut and dry,
No. Yeah.
and to give Lot a little grace for that too, right? Like he was doing the best he could in the particular situation that he was in the particular time and culture and customs in which he lived.
Right. Yep.
So like
Absolutely.
to learn some of that. So I have
Yeah.
actually two things that I would like to talk about with this whole like idea of hospitality and with radical welcome and what it means to welcome people into our spaces. And the first one is this about this idea of welcoming people, that when a lot of churches, say all are welcome, and what that actually like means and comes down to. And I'm finding more and more that the very, very like super progressive churches are actually starting to like take that down,
Mm-hmm.
because this idea of like it's really hard to actually like I don't know if there's actually really a space anywhere in our world that
Yeah.
exists where like
No.
everybody on all sides of the fence and all behaviors and whatever are welcome in a place.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's
Um,
hard to have. We used to talk about this all the time in Madison because we had a large unhoused population like near campus, and it's very, very hard to create a physical space where you're welcoming
yeah,
unhoused folks and also like college freshmen
yeah,
who don't know how to respond to that, right? And so I think the reality is that even if you wanted all people to be
yeah.
welcome, it's very hard to create an environment where that's actually true.
So one
Um,
of my colleagues in the Delaware Maryland Synod, I'll call him out. He won't be ashamed at all. At a training recently, he said he's like, we took the hymn "All Are Welcome" out of our rotation when we
mhm.
had to issue a restraining order to someone.
Yeah.
Because
Yep.
like while we are like that community is radically welcoming to folks of all races, all sexualities, all gender identities, there are still some things that like aren't necessarily
Aren't
welcome,
welcome.
right? And I think about it
Yeah.
this way. A few weeks ago in our podcast episode, we talked with Jamie Brieselhoff, who in her book Raising Kids Beyond the Binary, she addressed this and she said, like, yes, all people are welcome at the table. All people are welcome to the body of Christ, but not all behaviors are welcome in every space.
Yeah.
And so if you are like hardcore homophobic and whatever, like, are you welcome at the table? Absolutely.
Yeah,
Are
for
you
sure.
welcome to worship? Absolutely. But there are certain behaviors, like you are not welcome to be rude, mean, and
Yeah.
or any of those things, right? Like
Yeah. And like,
you don't get to be
yeah.
what's the word, like a like aggressive toward, like you don't get to be
Yeah.
you're like, and no one does, right? Like
Right.
if that makes
Well, and
sense.
like I was thinking about that interpretation too, like before we got on the call today, and I was thinking about the fact that I'm curious how that strikes you too, because like we have this whole legacy when it comes to how we understand queer identity around like that we, like hate the sin and love the sinner, right?
Yeah.
Which like to me, I'm like, this feels this feels like it's got some like echoes of that. And I was
Yeah.
thinking about it. I was like, oh yeah, I think we can say like we accept all people, we don't accept all behavior. And
Hmm.
then we have this whole like really troubling legacy of like all of us, that one person or like one group of people chooses like what behaviors are acceptable and what behaviors
Hmm.
are not acceptable or sinful.
Yeah.
And that's hard. Like that's a really, really hard thing to sort of stand with.
I always come back to this, and I say this to my like college students all the time. My states the congregation to be like, my job is not to save people.
Right.
I'm not dispensing salvation. That is not my
Yeah.
job. My job is to love and to serve and to guide
Mm-hmm.
people in their faith, right? And
Right.
so like Jesus does the saving. Jesus already did the saving that happened 2000 years ago. Like it's not like that's not my job. And so
Right.
to understand it in that perspective of like I that's not my does
Right.
that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that gets us into the question of then when you're uh sort of stewarding a community where you want people to be welcome and you want to be hospitable toward people,
Hmm.
then the question is, I think often our attention then is called not to like one individual person and what they want to do or say, but towards sort of how we manage the whole community and how we make a
Yeah.
space for everyone.
To me it's sort of like okay, like I think about working at camp, right? And so at the
Mhm,
beginning of every single week of camp that I've ever been a part of in multiple camps, you sit down with your campers and you create a cabin covenant. And these are the
mhm.
rules that you as a cabin agree to abide by. And it's mostly like, you know, not to hit, call people's names, things like that. Like
Right.
that's what these kids come up with, right? Like you
Yep.
let the kids come up with the covenant. And
Mhm.
and then we all sign it and everyone agrees that all week long that's what
This
our
is the
deal is
kind of
that
behavior that we're going to have for our
exactly.
community.
To
Yep.
be a part of this cabin, we agree that this is the how we want to live together as a
Right.
community. And sometimes I think like that's really the thing that we're talking about
Right.
as this idea, right? Like everyone is welcome to come here. Again, regardless of who you are, what you've done, where you've been, you are
Right.
welcome to come to the table. Jesus is always opening that. That is Jesus's
Right.
gift, not mine. And we say that at communion.
Mhm.
This isn't our table. This is God's table,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And
And
even like lots of different beliefs are welcome too, right? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
it's not
yeah,
about what you believe at all. I mean, you can believe all different kinds of things and be welcome in the community,
exactly. But
but
to
how
understand,
we,
like,
yeah,
sometimes I think fourth graders making a camp covenant figured it out better than some of the rest of
right.
our
Yeah.
parishioners, right? Like,
Don't say
what
mean
is,
things about people. Yeah.
yeah, don't say mean things about people. Don't hit people. Don't
Hmm.
walk into a church with a gun, right? Like, there's just like little things like that that like one would think, um, seems a pretty no-brainer, right? But like,
Yeah.
that's, do you know what I'm saying? Like, that to me is what it means to like
Right.
be in that hospitable space of sort of like that quote, all is welcome kind of space
Yeah.
is that
And
you
it
are
takes,
100% welcome. But and then
right.
it doesn't just apply to you, right? It applies to everyone. Not all behaviors are
Right.
welcome.
Right. And a whole, I think it also calls everybody in the community to be not aware of just their own, like to be more focused on other people than themselves, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
I have been a part of conversations where people have said things that other people in the group radically disagreed with, but where people have been able to say those things in a way that isn't necessarily, maybe it's still a little harmful, but it's not like weaponized, right? It's like,
Yeah.
like I disagree with this thing that's like that you believe, but I think when you're attentive to other people's emotions and their beliefs and their sort of experiences, like there's a lot of room for disagreement, but the attention has to be on the other people and how people, your words and
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
actions are being received. I
Yep.
mean, there are things that are just not okay too, but I think there is room for that, but there has to be sort of an attentiveness to the other and not
Mhm.
just to yourself. Yeah.
Well, and I think as we come down in our like super polarized, you know, system that we have in place in our country at this moment, I always come down on the side of this, of sort of like in a Christian space, I'm not the judge of anyone. You're not the judge of anyone.
Mm-mm.
God is the judge.
It's really good. It's actually
We
a
are
relief that we
here.
don't have to be the judge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank God
Yeah.
for that.
I
I
know.
should
I
say
don't
that
want to be
all
the
the
judge. Yeah.
I think I've said this on a podcast. I say it all the time in campus ministries. Thank God for that. Like
Hmm.
Jesus loves you. I think you're an asshole. Right?
Right.
Like, and that's okay,
Yeah.
right? Because again,
Yep.
like that's not my job. My job is to love and to serve.
Right.
My job is to create a space that you can grow and that you can feel safe,
Hmm.
right? And so how do we
Yep.
create that kind of space? And I think that's the biggest thing that we're working on, right? And
Right.
how do we do that, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah. Okay, anyways, the second thing that I wanted to say about this, and kind of how we were talking about it is sort of like hospitality and whatever, and especially welcoming folks that are not Christian by faith. You're gonna get this mindset in particular kinds of Christian of sort of like,
Hmm.
but Christ is the only way. So do we need to actually like, are we harming them by not, kind of
Mm.
forcing them to be Christian? I had this I preached at a different congregation recently. And this congregation is really great at like I can preach things there that I 100% cannot preach at my congregation. They're just like they're not ready for it, and that's fine.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Everyone's in a different place of learning, but I really enjoy preaching there because like I get to kind of go
Could say
out.
stuff that you couldn't
Yeah, I
otherwise.
just kind of get to go out and about and like talk about this
Yeah.
language, and it's really
Yeah.
great. But that was someone's I had talked about God's mercy and like who gets God's mercy. And I the story that I was given and that I talked about was the story of Cain and Abel. Like Cain kills his
Hmm.
brother, right? Um, but God and the language in Hebrew is covenant language. God makes a covenant with Cain
Hmm.
to protect him and care for him and to also make a great nation of him and all those things. I was like, so if, the first murderer in the Bible is allowed to have that kind of mercy and grace and covenant with God,
Yeah.
um, who is to say who's outside of
Right.
that? And I got pushback from one particular person that really was like honing in on this Jesus thing, right? Like Jesus is the way, and that if a person doesn't accept Jesus, right, then like no, they're out. And so this puts us in like that weird space as a Christian of talking about living into a multi-faith space, right?
Hmm.
And I like to come down on the side of I don't know. I
Yeah.
believe that as a follower
Yeah.
of Jesus, my job is to love you and create a space for you, and I believe God loves you too.
Right.
And that's it. And like I don't get to know all the fine details, and I'm fine with that.
Hmm.
Not everyone is, right? And so part of the pushback that like comes with this is these different ideas of like salvation, right? So like
Hmm.
there's a big one and most like conservative Christians that, believe that like Jesus is the only way. It has this sort of it's called supersessionism, right? That
Hmm.
like once Jesus came, everything else is void. There is
Right.
no way because Jesus says the
Right.
only way to the Father is through me. And so then there's this other mindset that takes that same thing that sort of like and I've talked about this on the podcast before, right? The John 3:16, right? That God so loved the world, he sent his only son to save the cosmos, right? That is everything, that everything
Hmm.
is included in that. It's not even just humans, because take away the anthropocentrism, like it's not just humans that came to
Yeah.
reconcile the
Yeah. Yeah.
entire cosmos to God. Great. So that's another perspective, is sort of this universal salvation kind of thing that like Jesus did the
Hmm.
work, it's done,
It's all
everyone is
done. We're
saved
good with it.
regardless of whatever, right?
Yeah.
That like the only way through the Father is Jesus. Great. Well, Jesus did the work for everyone. So it doesn't matter what you believe, what you do, whatever.
Right. Right. Right.
And that makes people very uncomfortable. And then there's like this other mindset, which I think is a dispensationalism, I think is what it's
Hmm.
called, where like God has different trajectories for the different faiths. I think it's mostly about Christian and Judaism, but then that like leaves everyone
Hmm.
else on still, and it's
Right.
just not quite great. Our rabbi that we had on a few weeks ago, he really likes that. He was like, "That's great. I love it. Christians can do their thing. We can do our things and agree that God
We're
loves
all
us
good.
anyways." I was like,
Yeah.
"That's
Yeah.
great."
Yeah.
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 And so I don't know. I come down on the side of like, I don't know, and I'm okay with that because I also firmly believe that like all a lot of the other religions are older than ours, right? Or that people, if God created the whole world, if we are all a part of God's creation and God says it is good and I love them and they're made in my image,
Hmm.
that means that all humans are, right? And so I can't believe in a God that says I made you and you're good. I made you, but you're bad.
You're
Like
not as good. Yeah.
it
Yeah,
doesn't,
yeah, yeah.
it doesn't actually like fit
Right.
in. That doesn't jive.
No.
And so like, I just leave it up to like, I think God has got it, whether we understand it or can fit it into our boxes that we can understand or not.
Yeah,
Does that
and I
make
think
sense? But I believe
yeah,
that
absolutely.
God can exist in those other
Yeah.
places and be with those other people, regardless of what I understand or regardless of what
Hmm.
my scriptures say. I can also
Right. And
blame Yagam for that. Yagam was
yeah.
really good at understanding like um, so Yagam is Young Adults in Global Mission, and a part of our training is, they bring you in and they really want you to know. So it's kind of like the Peace Corps. You go in for a year and you're serving in a place, whatever, and they want you to make it very clear to you, you are not taking Jesus to these people.
That's not your
You're
job.
not
Yeah.
taking God into this place. God's already there. Your job
Yeah.
is to see the God, how God is already at work and to work alongside them.
Hmm.
Right. And
Hmm.
so like that's my mindset is it's God's already at
Yeah.
work.
And yeah, and don't you think, I mean, I think too, as Christians, I mean, we are followers of Jesus, and if nothing else, I mean, Jesus modeled humility, right, to
Mhm.
us. I mean, that the idea that God, who's like super powerful, would give up the power of being a God, being God, and then choose to be human. I think that is something that calls us, I mean, it's what calls us to love, but it's also what calls
Yeah.
us to humility, right? So it's like, I think we can say with authority, right, that we believe that like Jesus is the way for us, or that Jesus is like the center, and like God's sacrificial love is the center.
Hmm.
Um, but I think you can say that with a lot of like faith for yourself, and also have a lot of openness to other people's experiences, other people's um other people's beliefs, and just on a really practical level too. I just don't know how helpful it is to, I mean, I just don't think it's a very effective form of evangelism to be like, hey, you're wrong. I'm going to scare you. Like, maybe, okay,
Yeah.
actually, maybe it is effective short term, but I'm not sure if it's actually, well, it's not in the spirit of Christ, but it's also just not long term effective, I don't think. Um,
Yeah. So it also leads to like, religious trauma that,
right. Yeah.
yeah,
Like that's not great. That's not where we're going here.
that's not how people, that's why I like, I don't care if you end up Lutheran at the end of the day. Maybe I'm not supposed to say that. I don't care if you end up Lutheran, but like, I would like to do ministry in a way that you don't leave traumatized, that you
Right.
leave being like, oh, those Lutherans, man, they really do
Hmm.
just love people.
Yeah. Yeah.
If that influences your faith in 10 years, 15 years from now, then I've done my job.
Hmm. And I think that like the other thing is, if when students feel loved, or when newcomers feel loved and they feel
Hmm.
accepted, I think that sparks curiosity too, because it is a really, I mean, in a lot of ways it's a super countercultural thing to do, right, to accept
Yeah.
somebody the way they are. um I
Yeah.
had a student at Wisconsin who was like, I was really surprised that like I came into the student center and I like studied and I drank your free coffee and I hung out, and I kept waiting for somebody to be like, you need to start going to church now. And eventually they did like go to church uh in our student community, but it wasn't because somebody told them they had to, right? It was
Hmm.
because they were kind of curious. They're like, these people are a little weird. Like, this isn't what I expected, right? And I
Yeah.
think, um, I don't know. I think that's invitational as opposed to
Yeah.
like
And I
being
think, I mean,
coercive,
I really think that like if we're doing the Jesus thing right, it should be countercultural.
right? Yeah, it is. It is, and it's countercultural to give up privilege, right? I mean, that's what this story is really about, right? Is that
Hmm.
like Lot is using the privilege that he has to care for people who are newcomers or outsiders.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think it's countercultural too to I mean, in our culture, hospitality in general is extremely countercultural. I mean,
Yeah.
and like an authentic hospitality that's not just like a way of like showing off how perfect you are by like throwing a really beautiful party, right? I mean, authentic hospitality is like inviting somebody into sort of, I don't know, like the mess of your actual life.
Yeah, exactly. No, it is, and that's true.
And
And I
exposing
think,
vulnerability to them, right? I
mhm,
mean, as opposed to just it being a like a transactional thing where you have more power or authority than somebody else.
yeah.
Yeah.
I say this, so this congregation that I'm at, one of the reasons like I really love it here is sort of like there I am accepted like just the way that I am, right? Like no one's expecting me to be like this perfect and proper pastor and like
Yeah.
and that's not the air
Yeah.
that's set and in a way that's like so beautiful that like you get to actually like do life with people.
Yeah.
And I kind of experienced that on other levels and other places, but also the exact opposite, right? And so like
Yeah.
it's I don't know, it's beautiful in that way when we talk about like welcoming like what that means, right? That like
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think the reality is that presenting the reality of our lives to other people is a more welcoming thing to do, right? Because I
Yeah.
mean, the reality is that most people are sharing the same form of like messiness, right? I mean, whether that's
Yeah.
like the messiness of like self-doubt or the messiness of like the day-to-day operations of our family lives or like the messiness of whatever. I mean, like existential worries about like what's going on in our world. Like, I don't know, most people are experiencing that. So when you're able
Yeah.
to acknowledge it, it lets you be present to somebody in a way that
Yeah,
you
that
can't
like
otherwise.
as a pastor, I don't have to be a perfect human
No.
or have all the answers or I don't know, you know, it just I'm in the life journey too,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah. Yep.
we're all in this together.
Yep. And we're all, yeah, and we're all trying to make sense of the complicated like questions and realities of the world around us. Hopefully with some, yeah, perspective that like comes through our faith, but
Yeah.
we're all trying.
Yeah. And like that's I don't know, to me that's the point. That's actually so on the day of Finley's baptism, I didn't baptize her because that felt weird.
Yeah.
Um
I
I
didn't baptize my kids either.
Yeah, I felt really weird. I invited a pastor to come in and do that. But I did still preach, right? And that's what I said in my sermon. Like that was the point of my whole sermon. I said I'm going to disagree with Yoda, who says, you know, Yoda says there is no try. You know, you do
Yeah.
not. There is no try.
Yeah.
And I said I'm going to do something really controversial, and I'm going to disagree with Yoda. I think that's all we do is try. That
Yeah.
when we
Yeah.
baptize someone into the body of Christ, I'm inviting you into the great trying.
Yeah.
We try, and we continue to learn and grow and, you know,
Hmm.
change. And that's part of our Lutheran identity is being
Yeah.
constantly changing, right? That
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
never have all the answers. We never have it all figured out. We continue to learn and to grow always. And we try. And like sometimes
Yeah.
we get it wrong and we have to start over, right? And like that's what it means, you know, to be a
Yeah.
part of this body of Christ.
There's this beautiful phrase in the Rule of Saint Benedict, and it basically like Benedict says when he's talking to these, monastic communities about what it's like to live together in community. He says, "Every day we begin again," and I love that, like the idea that like every day
Mm,
is just like a starting over of our attempt to walk with God and to walk with each
yeah.
other because
Yeah.
the reality is that we're probably going to like mess it up every day. So we better
Yep.
start over again. We need a restart over and over again.
Inviting into the great trying.
Hmm.
That's what faith is.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Pastor Emily, thank you so much for joining this on this great episode and this fun conversation.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I had a great time, just like I
Good.
always do when I talk to you.
Everyone, as always, we only have a few more episodes left in the season, but don't you worry back. We'll take a small break and be back in the fall. Again, still, if you are interested in purchasing one of our Pride t-shirts on our website, they are $20 and all proceeds go to the Reconciling Works organization for that and for our Becoming a Reconciling in Christ community. And by the way, when I mean like all proceeds, I actually mean just like all $20. So just like every t-shirt, I just tack that on to like this is what we're giving them. So please use up all of my budget buying these t-shirts to give to them. It's such an amazing organization. Remember, you can always learn more about the podcast at our website, 10footballpodcast.com, and find more on Facebook and Instagram at 10footballpodcast and wherever you listen to podcasts. And the 10 Football Podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care.